Balkan Threads is a podcast powered by Spunker that invites listeners to see the Balkans beyond political borders and stereotypes. I am your host, Lazar Tripinovic, and in each episode I talk with guests from across the region to share their personal stories. Together, we will explore the Balkans as a shared flow of traditions, experiences, and ideas. Dear listeners, thank you for listening to the third episode of Balkan Threads. Our guest for today is Lura Pollozhani. She is a researcher and policy advisor working in Austria and specializing in citizenship, social movements, and democratic consolidation in the Western Balkans. Her previous experience includes role as an advisor to the Prime Minister of North Macedonia. She is a passionate advocate for social justice and women's empowerment and one of the co-founders of the Stella Network. We will open today's episode with a quote from the prologue of Catch the Rabbit by Bosnian-Herzegovinian writer Lana Bastasic. My country, I realized soon, didn't have anything to do with a concrete geographic reference. It existed in my head because it was stored in my memories, and those in turn were stored in the language. My land is my language. Thank you for joining me here today. I am really excited today to talk with you. I have a few friends from Macedonia, and I was actually there for the first time last summer. And I really felt a special energy because I really felt something that I love, and that is different cultures really getting embodied together. I really felt different traditions of people who live there, like Macedonians and Albanians, that Slavic and Illyrian culture, but also of all the other people that have lived there ever since. Because I went to a few different archaeological sites, and it was really amazing to see how much of those ancient cultures are still present there. And to not just think of contemporary country of Macedonia, but to really understand how much Balkans as a region has changed over centuries and millennia. Oftentimes focus too much on just how the place we live in looks today, and we tend to lose all the historic significance that it had in different points in time. We always start this podcast by discussing specific parts of the country that our guests are from. So I would like to invite you to tell us a little bit more about your part of Macedonia, and then also your second country, your part of Kosovo.
Thanks, Lazar. I mean, that's a very kind of generous introduction to the country and the people who live in the country. And it's true that it's diverse and it's very colorful, and there's also history therein that makes it certainly very interesting, and both for outsiders and for people who are from there. I grew up in Struga, and Struga is near a city near Lake Ohrid, and Lake Ohrid I think everybody will be familiar with, but not so much Struga. But Struga, of course, has the beautiful, generous gift of the river Drin, that runs through the middle of the city, and in the summer you can swim. So every time I share pictures and videos in the summer of me swimming in the river, everybody's very surprised that you can swim in the middle of the city. And of course, next to Struga, we also have the town of Ohrid, which is much more full in historical remnants, let's call it, right? So you have the churches, you have the amphitheaters, you have the old bazaar, you kind of walk through history as well, and you have the mosques as well. So in that sense, it really melts into a melting pot. And also, I mean, Struga and Ohrid too are these cities where Estonian, you hear Albanian, you hear the Romanian language. So it's also linguistically very rich, as well as in terms terms of ethnic and religious diversity, which I appreciate for both Struga and Ohrid. Struga is also interesting in my view because it has kind of in Albanian, for example, we like to brag about the fact that it's a city that has both dialects. So in Albanian, we have the Geg and the Tosk dialects, as some of the listeners might know. And in Struga, there's villages that use the Geg dialect, and then there's villages that use the Tosk dialect. And this is highly unusual within a single municipality. So that makes Struga really special to me linguistically. And then kind of I grew up in this kind of community. It's not very big, it's quite small, but that has kind of this tradition of speaking Tosk language within the city, but then you're also influenced by Geg dialects. But of course, my mother is from Kosovo, and she's from Jakova, where I was also born. And in Jakova, there is a very famous Geg dialect with very strong R's and N's, which I kind of learned. So at home, I would speak, for example, the Geg dialect, and then in the street, I would speak the Tosk dialect more like, and the standard Albanian, so to speak. And even today, I can switch between dialects, for example, very easily. I recently had one talk in Prishtina, and I spoke in standard Albanian. And I think some people were a bit kind of surprised because in Kosovo, of course, there's also a debate whether you should speak standard or speak the Geg dialect. But to me, I was wondering because since I got educated in Struga, they take very big pride in speaking the standard Albanian. I was taught to speak of serious matters, let's call it, or in public avenues to speak in the standard Albanian because that's how I feel comfortable. And that's how I grew up. And then kind of the Geg dialect for me is the intimate, the dialect of home and of kind of these intimate relationships, and not so much this public dialect. Of course, I also studied and learned Macedonian. I went when I was growing up in Struga. There was no pre-primary school in Albanian language. There was only kindergarten available in Macedonian, and then that changed. Then there was a grade open in Albania. So my first few years of kindergarten, I did in Macedonian, and I spoke Macedonian fluently, and then I did them in Albanian. And then I forgot the Macedonian only to have to relearn it again when I learned it at school. So it's always, I feel like the Balkans is very typical in this travel between languages, between dialects, and not just this physical travel between cities and kind of cultures, which I find very beautiful.
It really is, and I think we definitely have to be more aware of it in order to be able to cherish it because that is definitely a beautiful part of our heritage. And I have two questions. The first one is about for listeners who are less familiar with Albanian language. What are some of the main differences between the Tosk and the Gig, or like what is the geographic distribution, and how did it happen that in Struga and Ohrid there's both dialect? And how is really this experience of bilingualism for you? And how would you say it generally works in Macedonia on a social level, but also on well, how is that organized also on an administrative level?
The second question is quite large and tricky, but very important. And so I'll start with that, although I'll jump also to the first question as well. Basically, I think, for example, I personally find it very important to grow up with kind of bilingualism or as many languages as you can speak. I have found in my life that perhaps because I learned both in and studied both in Albanian and Macedonian and later in English, I am very quick at catching new languages. And I do think it has expanded my kind of vocabulary, my viewpoints, and my kind of way of looking at the world. But unfortunately, I mean, in the Balkans, language is not just language, right? It's also very political. So sadly, language is often used as a political weapon rather than a method of communication that we should adapt and adopt and develop. So in that sense, I think there's been very often in my life moments of friction that have been related to language. So in the professional setting and in the personal settings, But for example, I remember when it was the 2001 conflict in Macedonia, so there were a lot of unrest, right? And it was a very difficult time for the country. And there was violence. The situation was boiling up to potential war. And I remember I went with my mother in Skopje for a visit. I would go there to see a doctor for my braces. And we were walking in the main shopping mall, Gataca, in the middle of Skopje. And I remember that my mom told me, don't speak Albanian because, we're not safe. And that was the first time in my early life that I discovered that speaking a certain language or being of a certain community meant that you could be unsafe or not feel safe or not be protected within a state. And of course, that is a sad lesson for any child to learn. And it's also kind of introduces this tension of in the idea of safety and belonging. And to me, that was very strange, considering that in Struga, for example, I could speak Albanian openly, but then Struga is a majority Albanian town. And of course, in Skopje, that dynamic shifted, considering that in Skopje, even to this day, even though Skopje is multi-ethnic, has always been multi-ethnic, but still it had a majority and has a majority of ethnic Macedonians. So in this sense, I often find the politics of language and how it builds up one's identity and belonging. I also remember when I was then later on working in as a researcher. I remember I wrote an article called I think it was called "Me the Enemy" or something like that, and it kind of made an argument for why a law on languages in Macedonia was important. In that time, I remember when I published it, there was so much reaction, both good and kind of careful reactions, where you're like, yeah, you should speak your language, but it shouldn't endanger mine. And I always am shocked by these debates on endangerment, this idea that if you speak another language or if you learn another language, it's going to put you in danger. And I find this to be a very false premise, but sadly, it is a very dominant premise in the Balkans and in Macedonia particularly. I've encountered it again and again in different avenues. In when I've given trainings, I've been kind of faced with this question. When I've worked in the government, I've been faced with this question. So in that sense, I find that sadly the beauty of linguistic diversity often gets lost because of the polemics and the political narratives that frame it. And then if you look at the microcosmos of Struga and of Ohrid, for example, you also, I don't know if, because you mentioned that you'd been to Macedonia, so I don't know exactly where, but in Macedonia, of course, the Macedonian language also has a lot of dialects. So the Struga dialect, for example, I was very used to hearing the Struga Macedonian, that when I went to live in Skopje, I couldn't understand a lot of the Macedonian that they were speaking because I went to an international school and there I kind of got exposed to different dialects. We had friends from Eastern Macedonia, and them I could not understand at all in the beginning. It took me a year and more than that to understand what the hell they were saying to me. And then, of course, there was the Macedonian of Skopje, which is a bit more city, has these big city vibes. They also use more Serbian words for slang sometimes, which I didn't understand at the time. So I really felt very lost when I moved to Skopje from Struga, because Struga has this more mellow Macedonian and softer Macedonian accent. And of course, it's, the language of the Miladinovci brothers. And it has also this poetic, and also Ohrid has this poetic kind of vibe to it, right? And I think ethnic Macedonians are quite proud of that. Going into kind of the institutional and the legal in North Macedonia, now we have a lot of issues in the sense of the implementing the law on languages. We have a conservative government now that has taken upon itself. For example, we had tables in two languages, like directions for roads and such in two languages or three languages, and now they're being taken down. So it often feels like every time there's a step forward, there's steps back, because again, we're framing language in terms of animosity and not in terms of you're communicating with your citizens.
You're definitely right. For us who speak Serbo-Croatian, the situation is oftentimes really surreal. One synonym is preferred over the other. Do you think that the situation in Macedonia was the same as it is today, like 50 years ago, when it comes to respect for minority languages and general tolerance for one another?
It has definitely changed. I mean, if we're looking at, I'll only talk about Macedonia from independence. So I will not refer to Macedonia under socialism. That's a different system, and would require a lot more hours in this podcast. But for example, of course, I think when Macedonia first got its independence, there was this almost fear of Albanians, politically speaking, but also a little bit socially speaking, in the sense that it was seen that if Macedonia gave too much rights to Albanians, the Albanians would take over the country, or that the Macedonian identity would be put at risk. So there was very much this animosity in the communities. This also was kind of put into more of attention where, for example, in the referendum to make Macedonia independent, the story goes that it's 97, 98% that voted pro leaving Yugoslavia and for Macedonia to be independent. But this is 97% of the people who voted, and famously, ethnic Albanians didn't vote in the referendum. But then Albanians at that time had their own referendum for joining this greater Albania. It's a referendum that failed. I mean, there was support for it, but it didn't lead to any kind of separation or anything like that. And then we have in the 90s a very kind of tense period where Albanians want to get more rights from the states because now they feel like the rights of the Albanians in the states have gotten less than they were during even Yugoslav times, which weren't so glorious either. So in that sense, there was this tension. There was a lot of violent moments, for example, when the University of Tetovo opens, because at this point, you could not study at university level, you could not study in Albanian, you could only study the Albanian language in Albanian. So the only language you could study in would be Macedonian in the public universities. And then after the 2001 conflict, language is a big part of the Ohrid Framework Agreement. And so is, for example, education. Although we have the law, it's still contested. And this contestedness has made it very easy for political parties to play with it, both from the ethnic Albanian side and from the ethnic Macedonian side. So language has become one of the main issues of contention, which is really unfortunate because it feels sometimes that you're fighting a fight for years for something that is very simple, like the right to communicate in your own language. And I find that very frustrating. I think things have gotten better. I don't think we're as bad in Macedonia as before 2001. I do think that the Ohrid Framework Agreement, for all its minuses, has led to better conditions for communities, not just for Albanians, but for all the other communities, although to a lesser extent. But I think we still, in Macedonia, we still have this issue where we still don't fully trust the other communities. Ethnic Albanians don't fully trust ethnic Macedonians, and ethnic Macedonians don't fully trust ethnic Albanians. And that's why I think we still have political parties that are very nationalist from both sides that keep winning elections because they touch exactly on this fear. And very often this fear is incited via language. Although I'm quite hopeful for the future, I still see that these tensions are very stubborn.
Yes, I think that's such a complicated matter, but I see so much paradox in it because, as you were mentioning, there's so much dialect. You were talking about Albanian and Macedonian, but also with other Balkan languages, generally so much regional difference. And even for the speakers of one language, they can sometimes experience a side eye when they speak a certain dialect. So to me, it's always really ironic when one language speakers start coming after another language speakers.
You mean that there's also like this intra discrimination also in the level of dialects?
Exactly. Like in Serbia, people who come from the southern parts of the country, sometimes just by their speech get identified and mocked. So it's so ironic then that we come we come for people who speak our language and we come for people who speak another language.
it's like we can't win. But
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, for example, when I went to first live in Kosovo as a grown up, I had this idea that I was gonna feel very like this great sense of belonging because you could speak Albanian everywhere, right? And everybody spoke Albanian to you. I've heard of many Albanians from Macedonia, for example, who have gone to live in Kosovo or in Albania, who for whom this first feeling of, everybody speaks my language is a very freeing kind of sentiment in that sense. But then, for example, I saw that in Pristina, because of my Jakovar dialect, immediately I would get, picked on for being from Jakova, although I never thought that my dialect is so strong because I never lived in Jakova for long periods of time. And then they would also pick on me for when I would speak standard Albanian, as if I was trying to be on a high horse, which is not, as I said, it's not the case because for me this is just how I grew up and how I understand how I speak in a public space. But it's very interesting that we assign particular meanings to dialect. And you're right in the sense that, I see where you're coming from with the comparison. I don't know how it is, for example, in for a Serbian from Kosovo who might go to Belgrade, and how that translates.
It's a similar story because people in Serbs in Kosovo speak like people in southern Serbia, and those are what we call like the old dialect. And people mock them. It's usually used even in like movies. Sometimes it can be used to communicate somebody who's rural, less educated. There's definitely like a lot of negative stereotypes connected to that. I would want to go one step back and then also talk about different languages and identities within Kosovo. I've been to Prizren. In Prizren, the situation to me seemed very pleasant, very ideal almost. It was, I heard a lot of obviously Albanian, but I heard a lot of Serbian, I heard a lot of Turkish. Obviously, knowing more about the history, that is not necessarily the case. But on the surface level, at least, I would never guess that there is a level of tension. But as somebody who is much more knowledgeable than I am, where do you think this tension, I guess, lies?
Well, to be honest, in Kosovo, the law on the use of languages, but the way also that the law is implemented is much better than in Macedonia, way better. And I'll show you some examples of kind of my experience. I worked at the European Center for Minority Issues as one of my first jobs. And it was to kind of show myself that I don't just care about minority rights when it comes to me, but also when it comes to other communities. So it was kind of to test myself as well. I remember we would be in meetings, and if there was one person who spoke Serbian, the whole group, especially if they were a group of people in the meeting who were 30 plus, they would all speak Serbian. All Albanians would speak Serbian in order for this one guy or woman who was a Serb to understand them. And I mentioned the age here because, of course, it's people who are older who would speak Serbian because, for example, they grew up when Kosovo was still part of Yugoslavia. So in that sense, they had also had education in Serbian. I was personally positively surprised at the willingness to switch languages when it would suit the minority community in this case. This is something I would never see in Macedonia. And I've worked in public administration in Macedonia. I've worked also in NGOs, and I wouldn't see this understanding there. I do think in Kosovo, I'm not saying that there isn't tension, but in terms of applying language, especially in this day-to-day basis, there is a better way. Now, I guess with younger generations, this will be different because I think younger generations of Albanians do not know Serbian, but they're quite accommodating, for example, in Kosovo to switch quickly to English. And then also in terms of linguistic rights, you mentioned Prizren, for example. In Prizren, even though if you look at percentages, these are not very big communities that we're talking about, but still because of the law of languages, low threshold for using for languages of minorities being in use, or in this case, non-majority communities being in use. You have Turkish, you have Bosnian, you have Serbian, and it works. It works. And this is why I get pissed whenever people make language laws seem like they don't work or they cost money. Do they cost money? Yes, they do. Translation costs money. Other stupid things that governments do also cost money. But in this case, you're doing something to make the lives of citizens citizens easier. You're making it easier for them to understand public administration. You're making it easier for them to understand laws. You're making it easier for them to be part of society. I don't see what is so complicated about that. And I hold this belief whichever country we're in. Of course, for example, if we go to to Jakova, because of the traumas from the war, I think this would be a sensitive topic to talk about. I mean, if you speak Serbian in the city, I don't think it's going to be the same as if when you speak Serbian in Pristina. I understand, though, if, for example, members of the Serb community there might feel threatened, because I think generally there's also this idea of lack of safety because of the physical limitation of living in certain communities. And I think their feeling of safety decreases once they leave these municipalities because of narratives, because of also having had bad experiences, I'm sure, at certain times, which kind of reinforce these fears. So in that sense, I find it that, of course, there's different contexts, right? So in Jakova, I find that this is very much a hard topic because of the legacies of the war, because of the people lost, because of the fact that Serbia has still not apologized for any of it. And of course, here, I'm not saying that because Serbia hasn't apologized, all Serbian people are in any way kind of should be seen with this animosity. But especially in the case of Kosovo, it's so important to take transitional justice seriously. And in Macedonia too, we haven't dealt with the 2001 conflict. And unless we can really talk about justice, true justice having been served to victims, then all of these issues like language always touch on this wound. And it's very painful, but it's also very destructive because, again, we're talking about people who live in a certain country, people who are citizens of a certain country and want to participate in that certain country. So as long as there's this desire to participate and be part of the community, I think it's the state's responsibility always to make this possible. I always kind of swim in between these different identities. It also makes me sometimes wonder whether it being between languages and being between accents and also between countries, I still have the sense of rootlessness. I move, I change jobs, and I'm quite comfortable with this move. So I hate moving physically, but I'm comfortable with it in the sense of conceptually, I don't feel so torn by it. There's a beauty to it. There's also a sadness to it in the sense that you never feel like you truly belong anywhere. In the end, to discover that you belong to yourself. In the Balkans, we need this a little bit more, this idea that we can be part of different cultures and different ways of being.
Having to swim even within something that to the outsiders might come across as one identity, for example, Albanian language, you had to still swim within the differences of that one perceived identity and then to go from one identity also to another. And that is definitely a lot, but it also gave you a lot when you later had to move to a different place. Even if it's something that seems really banal, like there's a lot of people from Montenegro who live in Serbia, like my family, that's not universal given experience, right? You do have to voice it. And just understanding, for example, those different processes, right? Like border changes, language, minority rights, helped me so much to adapt to any environment. Why I'm saying this is to highlight there's so much potential in these experiences that we mentioned today and that so many people in the Balkans have, and that unfortunately we don't always use it for good. But there's really so much potential to learn from one another and to learn from collective paths to help us be really adaptable in the Balkans, but also much beyond them.
No, I agree. I agree. And I would just say that, I mean, being a minority is not easy. It's not easy for many reasons. And then if the state sees you as an enemy, it becomes even harder, right? I do think, though, there is a silver lining, but I don't want to say that, oh, it's okay to suffer, but rather that I feel like every minority, if they make it in life, they become overachievers. And this also goes in terms of gender. Of course, statistics show how women overperform in order to be at the same place as a man who maybe underperforms but shows potential. And it's the same with minorities very often. I think we have, my PhD is on, I did my PhD on citizenship and having a citizen based mentality, I specifically shun this idea of civic as opposed to ethnic, because I don't think being of an ethnic group is a bad thing. And I don't think the word ethnicity is a dirty word. And I see very often laws and institutions take ethnicity as a dirty word because they think, oh, but, minorities are going to ask for their thing or something like that. I think ethnicity is, a category of belonging. And as citizens, we have these rights. And as citizens, we deserve to be heard. And as citizens, we deserve to be on equal footing with with all the other citizens. And most importantly, building more solidarity. I think this is something that we're missing, and that's something we need to see, because being part of small communities like ours, and I mean small not in the sense of numbers, but these countries are not so big. We live so close. We often complain in the Balkans that the mentality, because everybody knows everybody and everybody knows about everything. But this is beautiful, because this is exactly what solidarity and community can be built upon. I guess what I'm trying to say is that understanding that life for minorities is hard and is not easy is an important precondition to understanding the need for solidarity with them. And I think for anybody who starts life and here I'm not just including ethnic minorities, but also other minorities, because we very rarely talk, for example, about people with that have kind of limited ability, mobility, things like that.
To conclude our discussion today, I would like to talk a little bit about Stella Network. You are one of the founders of this
Yes.
organization, which is a multilingual and international organization that offers various kinds of mentorships to women. What made you decide on specific areas you were going to focus in when it comes to gender advancement and offering more opportunities for women in the Balkans?
Well, the way we got inspired to do this is because most of the people of us who are the founders were getting individual requests for advice on how to apply to universities, how to apply to schools or jobs. So we decided, if we're all getting these requests, why not pool our resources so we can help more women? And I think the main thing that we wanted to do is create these I keep talking about solidarity, and that's what Stella is. It's a network of solidarity where we help each other out, either through career advice, education advice, and then with the town hall meetings, we try to expand this advice based on the needs that women have, and women and girls have. Mostly, we started also because we would see, for example, that a lot of statistically more women than men are finishing education, but there are more men than women in the work market, in the job market. So that means a lot of women are getting lost in between. So they choose not to pursue a career, they choose not to pursue further education, even though they perform well in school and university. So we wanted to see where is the gap, and whether we could help bridge that gap, whether we could help women who had been stuck after university and now didn't know how to apply for a job or a grant or whatever they needed. Then we also saw the need, for example, in our town hall discussions, with addressing workplace issues like sexual harassment, like being paid less than men. All of these issues kept coming up, and women were very honest and open about them, even though these are not, especially the topic of sexual harassment in the workplace, these are not easy topics, and they are also not topics that are taken seriously by any of the governments in the region. Having the opportunity to create these safe spaces for women to talk about these things, to not feel judged, but supported, I think is very important. And this is what we try to do with the Stella Network. And also what I think more and more states should do. Women in the region do not feel safe. This is not newsflash. The fact that we see femicides almost on a daily basis, especially if we take all the countries of the region, the statistics can be horrendous. The fact that we still, think that women are less than, or that they're the property of men, and this is shown in how we even talk about women and where we place women. For example, in Kosovo, if you see most of the TV shows on politics and important issues, quote unquote, it will be men that will be mostly talking. Very rarely will you have a woman present more than once, And I'm sick of watching these shows. I don't want to watch them anymore because they're very secluded spaces. And then you see shows that that talk about women's issues, quote unquote, made all by women. So we're still in this parallel world. So I think there is really a need for, and on the other hand, here I would like to also mention that it's not just the Stella Network. You have all these amazing feminists and feminist work that, they've been active, they protest, they raise their voice, and they're perhaps some of the most consistent activists in that sense in the region. So I do believe there is a need to support such activism. There's also there's need for organizations such as Stella. We have seen that there's really a lot of willingness from women to help. So we have a lot of mentors, or how we like to call them, more mentors. At one point, we had more mentors than we had mentees, and now that number is balancing as more and more women are feeling like they can reach out. It's a beautiful process, I think, where we really help each other out to become the best versions of ourselves that we can be, and the best humans we can be. Also, our team has expanded with younger women who are, they're really amazing, and they keep Stella alive.
So I wanted to ask, what would be your advice for young girls who want to get into policy making?
First of all, don't be scared of mistakes. I think we, especially women, get conditioned into this idea that we're not supposed to ever make mistakes. We're not supposed to ever make the wrong decision. And that stops us from making bold decisions. That stops us from pursuing roles and pursuing jobs and pursuing opportunities. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. This is a fight I fight with myself every day. I have this fear and I fight it every day. Don't be afraid to say no. Also is important. I think sometimes because we want to make it, we want to achieve, sometimes we end up saying yes to too many things and we end up burning out. And among women, this is particularly high, considering also the care that they have to take at home, the care over labor, let's say. And then lastly, I would say believe in yourself and trust in yourself, for as kitschy as it sounds, because we do live in a world that is constituted of disbelief in women. So I think the most rebellious act that we can do is to trust and believe in ourselves and our abilities, even when the world would tell us otherwise.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful conclusion. And I would invite all of our listeners to check the work of Stella Network. The network operates in different places, and as I said, it offers work in English, Albanian, and Macedonian. And there's so many wonderful resources even beyond this network. So please give it a look. And as Lura said, don't be afraid to engage and to ask for something that you feel belongs to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lazar.
Thank you so much for the conversation today. I learned so much. This conversation could have went for twice as long as it did, and I'm sure we would have learned even more. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Ciao.